Hello everyone, very good evening. I welcome all viewers to CCI webinar. I'm Dr. Mahesh Jansari, Assistant Professor in Department of Pulmonary Medicine at KEM Hospital, Mumbai. Chest Council of India has been delivering webinars for over a year now, and all credit goes to Dr. N.H. Krishna, Founder National President, Dr. Narayana Pradeepa, Founder General Secretary. I would like to thank Dr. Narendra Methiku, President National President, Dr. Ravi Dosi, President National General Secretary, and Dr. Vijay Kumar Chenam Shetty, who is our webinar coordinator. I appreciate Dr. N.H. Krishna and Dr. Vijay Kumar Chenam Shetty for designing a unique idea of cross-specialty webinars. Last week, CCR delivered a webinar on gastroesophageal reflux disease, and it was attended by over 1,000 of viewers. Likewise, this week also we have a unique webinar titled Are You Breathless or Obese? It is being presented by Dr. Neeta Deshpande, who is a consultant diabetologist and bariatric physician. She is a professor and HOD medicine in Dental College, Belgaum. She has several presentations on obesity and diabetes in national and international meetings. She was a past president of Karnataka RSSDI, and she was a coordinator of Consensus Group Clinical Practice Recommendations for Type 2 Diabetes 2020. So over to you, Dr. Nita Deshpande.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahesh, for that very, very kind introduction. And I thank the Chess Society for having given this wonderful opportunity for me to address you all on this very important topic of the connection between obesity and pulmonary disease. The connection is very deep, but unfortunately, it has never been explored to the extent that it should be, in the sense that it is not talked about as much as it should be. The reason is the metabolic consequences of obesity have taken precedence over the musculoskeletal and pulmonary complications of obesity. But nevertheless, it is the most important cause, or rather a very common cause of morbidity and mortality, and hence it needs to be looked into. And this can only be done with the collaboration of a chest physician, pulmonologist, and an obesity physician, and perhaps an endocrinologist. If all of them work in tandem, definitely the outcomes of such a patient with obesity and pulmonary complications are going to be much better, and lifespan can be increased, morbidity also can be increased. So I'm very glad to be addressing this august audience. At the outset, I would like to say that I would not really be dealing with the pulmonary management of these complications, because all of you are so good at it and you're experts in the field. However, what I would attempt to draw your attention to during the course of this lecture is to draw the connection between these two very important issues, and how we need to go about it, and what we need to keep in mind when we're looking at patients with obesity and pulmonary respiratory disorders. So I shall now start by sharing my screen. Yes. An obese person, most of the times you would have seen, is breathless. And that's why we have this topic today: is he breathless or is he obese? So basically, we're going to talk about all the pulmonary aspects of obesity. And this would be the overview of my talk, where I'm going to tell you very briefly the definition of obesity. Then I'm going to tell you about obesity and the respiratory mechanics, or rather how it changes and causes all the problems. And then two or three very important pulmonary complications of obesity and how obesity severely affects these, that I'm going to tell you. One is, of course, obstructive sleep apnea. The second is obesity hypoventilation syndrome, and a few others. And the last part is, what are we going to do about this? The complications will be managed, but can we actually reverse some of those things that are happening is what we are going to see during the course of this lecture. So all of you know this, the classification of overweight and obesity based on body mass index, we all know this. However, I would like to point your attention to the fact that we have different guidelines. The Asia Pacific guidelines, the cutoffs are much lower. The reason being the Asian Indian phenotype. The Asian Indian phenotype simply means that even at lower BMIs, our population accumulates more fat, especially visceral fat. And hence, the cutoffs have been lowered for Asia Pacific region, and anything more than 23 is considered actually as overweight, and anything more than 25 is considered as obese. But this is according to body mass index. Does body mass index tell you the whole story? Often not. So, though most of the patients who are overweight by BMI also have increased adiposity, increased visceral adiposity, there are also a large number of patients, a huge chunk in fact, where the BMIs are very close to normal, but they are metabolically not normal, and that is because the body fat in them may be more important. And the body fat that is there, that can be measured by various means, but it is not measured in routine practice. We still don't have guidelines for that. We still don't know what the best method may be. We do bioelectric impedance technologies are used, and they you can measure body fat. That is something to consider, and that still is not in the mainstream. But yet, as I run an obesity clinic, we make it a routine fact to at least look at the body fat and measure the body fat percentage, look at the visceral adiposity, try to look at least the surrogate markers and see how it is. So this is the basic classification of overweight and obese by body mass index. And this is good to know. It's important to know even as a pulmonologist, because this is going to give you the prognosis of your patient with respiratory problems. Now, this is a very famous slide. It has different forms, but this slide tells you all the different complications of obesity in all the different systems of the body. But today, the focus of our attention is pulmonary. So we are going to talk about hypoventilation, talk about obstructive sleep apnea, asthma, and some related factors to this. So we will restrict ourselves to the pulmonary complications and consequences of obesity. So let's now go and turn towards respiratory mechanics as they change in obesity. So what are the basic, this is the root cause, and you're going to try and rectify this part of it, because this is the root cause of all the future problems in an obese person. And this may start in a very small way, but nevertheless, there are studies which have been shown that respiratory mechanics are definitely altered in obesity because of the deposition of fat around the area of the lungs. So basically, this is the very simplistic way that I have put it in. As the BMI rises, it lowers the FEV1, it lowers the FVC, it lowers the FRC, and it lowers the ERV. So all the capacities of the lungs, all the different kinds of capacities of the lungs, as you would check on spirometry, are going to be reduced as the BMI keeps on rising. It gets worse. So all lung capacities are reduced, and this is the genesis of all the future problems of respiratory system in an obese person. Now again, I have already talked to you about BMI, and I have talked to you about central obesity. So is there a difference to the respiratory system whether a person is centrally obese or he has peripheral obesity? Well, abdominal obesity is associated with worsening lung function and respiratory systems, and there are several references for this. Elevated waist to hip ratio, again a surrogate marker of visceral and abdominal adiposity, had good correlation with impaired lung function. So we have evidence to tell us that abdominal obesity, or rather visceral obesity, is the more dangerous one, and that underscores the point that simply checking BMI is not enough. You need to have some measures of abdominal obesity to prognosticate respiratory disease in an obese individual. And it is now known that peripheral obesity is associated with fewer medical complications and better lung function comparatively. Now, what does that excess weight on the anterior chest wall do? You know that you have fat deposition in various areas, including the anterior chest wall, when a person starts to get obese. So when there is excess deposition of fat in the anterior chest wall, it lowers the chest wall compliance. At the same time, it lowers the respiratory muscle endurance. And do you know the reason why? The reason is because of the reduced compliance, the respiratory muscle has to work overtime and to overcome that. And while doing that, it can get exhausted and ultimately it lowers the respiratory muscle endurance. There is increased airway resistance because of the excess weight on the anterior chest wall. And this ultimately results in increase in the work of breathing. So because of all these reasons, there is a huge respiratory compromise. Sorry for that. Then there are two things. Obesity and lung malfunction have a two-way relationship, just like obesity and liver disease. So obesity causes lung malfunction, and lung malfunction or respiratory disorders in turn cause worsening of the obesity, and I'm going to show you how. So first, let us see how obesity causes respiratory malfunction. So as I said, there is this visceral fat that you have. You have it in the subcutaneous area and you have in the viscera itself. So all of this is going to hinder diaphragmatic movement, definitely, because there's so much of fat over there. I told you what happens when there is fat in the anterior chest wall. Now this is fat in the abdomen. So it hinders diaphragmatic movement. It diminishes the basal lung expansion during inspiration. And then there is closure of peripheral lung units, because of which you have ventilation perfusion abnormalities and arterial hypoxemia. So this is the basis of how fat in the anterior chest wall and fat in the abdomen and viscera cause respiratory malfunction at a very, very basic level. What about the opposite thing? The opposite thing also is true. But as I said, these changes contribute to an increase in prevalence of respiratory problems in obese individuals, particularly on exertion and in the supine position, because in the supine position, the diaphragmatic movement is hindered even further, more units may close. How does the opposite happen? How do respiratory problems worsen obesity? Respiratory problems ultimately giving rise to OSA or COPD, they can cause hypoxia. And hypoxia is a trigger for the release of adipocytokines from the huge mass of adipose tissue, and this results in chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation worsens insulin resistance, causes more laying down of fat, and increases the obesity. So as I said, it's a two-way relationship. Obesity causes respiratory problems and vice versa. Then come some of the symptoms that the patients may come with. So the most important thing is dyspnea on exertion. And this is just one example I'm showing you where dyspnea on exertion in obese women, mind you, they have no other problems, but they're dyspneic. And this is associated with an increased oxygen cost of breathing. So in this particular study, what they found was a 70% increase in oxygen demand in dyspneic obese women when compared with obese control. So this is quite huge. Imagine a 70% increase in oxygen demand. Obviously, such persons are going to be dyspneic. And therefore, this study has linked exertional dyspnea with an elevated work of breathing, because there was no other identifiable difference in pulmonary function, respiratory system mechanics, body composition, fat distribution, and surprisingly, no evidence to support any cardiac deconditioning. So the only thing that you can think of is increased work of breathing, and this is how these patients come with dyspnea. Even 2 flights of stairs is an effort. They become dyspneic. Heart may be normal. Everything else also may be normal. The other important thing which I alluded to just a little while ago is respiratory muscle deterioration. Before I even go into this slide completely, you must understand that the fat percentage of these patients, of very obese patients, is so high that the fat to fat free mass, the ratio is completely skewed, and comparatively in relation their muscle mass has deteriorated. They have very less muscle mass, because of which there is a problem with the respiratory muscle. So reduction in the overall fat free mass is basically muscle mass. Added to that, you have this additional oxygen demand, which I told you, which may be 70% more. Because of this, there is a heightened sensation of breathlessness. So this extra oxygen demand sometimes cannot be met with, because the respiratory muscles are also less. They are not atrophied, but the muscle mass itself is less, so they cannot give that extra push, and then the person feels breathless. So this is what happens. And the elevated mechanical workload of obesity can overburden the respiratory muscles through a combination of increased work of breathing and apparent reduction in respiratory muscle efficiency. But there's some good news for these kind of patients. And what's that good news? The good news is that studies have demonstrated that weight loss helps restore the function of respiratory muscle. So that's the best part of it. That person undergoes weight loss, the fat percentage comes down, little muscle mass also could get built up because of exercise and proper diet, and then the function of the respiratory muscle is restored. Both respiratory symptoms and functions have improved following bariatric surgery. So weight loss does help, and this is where the pulmonologist's role comes in, to motivate the patients to lose weight. How to lose weight, we will see a little later, but the patients must get motivated. They must be told that your symptoms can really reduce very well if you reduce your weight, because all these respiratory mechanics that I have just talked to you about, they can improve by leaps and bounds if the person just manages to lose a little weight. So weight loss can reverse the reduction in pulmonary function and increase dyspnea commonly associated with obesity. And we have seen it. We run very successful weight loss programs in which, when patient loses even just 6 to 8 kilos, they start sprinting up the stairs, literally. Their breathlessness comes down, their work of breathing is better, and they really do well. So, and there is enough evidence also to show all of this. Now coming to some of the specific problems of obesity and respiratory problems, you all know that the most important one among them is obstructive sleep apnea. Obstructive sleep apnea is not merely a respiratory disorder, it is a forerunner of very many sinister metabolic problems. It's a forerunner, or rather a foreteller, of increased morbidity and mortality, and hence OSA has to be taken seriously. So all bariatric physicians and people, physicians looking at diabetic and obese individuals must look out for OSA. It is not often looked into, and all pulmonologists who are treating OSA must know that obesity should be treated so that the OSA levels come down, or the severity comes down. Basically, I don't have to tell you all of this. This is just like a refresher for you. The most important thing that happens in OSA is the collapsible upper airway while the patient is asleep. That's the most important thing. And this leads to repeated obstructive apneas, and this causes repetitive nocturnal oxygen desaturations. And all of this leads to fragmented sleep and excessive daytime somnolence and very bad sleep patterns. So this, in a nutshell, is what happens to a patient who has obesity and who develops OSA. The worst part is that his sleep gets disturbed, and because of this disturbed sleep, his hormonal rhythms and patterns get disturbed. His obesity can worsen, and I'm going to show you how it turns into a vicious cycle. There are certain predictors of OSA. Who are those people who get obstructive sleep apnea? Obviously, obese individuals. The risk of developing OSA increases considerably with a higher BMI. And if morbidly obese, you can see here that the risk of an individual developing OSA lies between 55 to 90%. So almost all of them with morbid obesity get OSA. But is that the best predictor? Not really. A better predictor than that is checking out the neck circumference. So a large neck circumference of more than 17 inches and a higher oral Mallampati score, which you all know is what anesthetists use, which denotes an anatomically narrow upper airway. So this neck circumference could be a better predictor of OSA than actually the body mass index. And now there are studies to show that even better than both of these is the abdominal circumference. So abdominal circumference has been shown to be a better predictor than both neck circumference and BMI according to certain studies. So what does this mean? It means that all these three predictors can be used, and we should use these predictors to know who are those people at risk of getting obstructive sleep apnea. We need to look out for that. We need to evaluate them, assess them even better. Well, the consequences of OSA, as I already told you, are not just respiratory, they are metabolic as well. So you can have insulin resistance, which can worsen. You can have atherogenesis, and that is the reason that morbidity and mortality is increased. There is increased fat deposition and inflammation because of the hypoxia. So atherogenic dyslipidemia is also known, and oxidative stress, inflammation, everything increases because OSA causes hypoxia, hypoxia causes inflammation and oxidative stress, and all of this, everything worsens. So moderate OSA, where the apnea hyperapnea index is more than 15 events per hour, and severe OSA, where the AHI is more than 30 events per hour, are associated with an increased mortality. So you can actually quantify and predict what is going to happen to these patients, tell them the mortality rates as well. What is the pathophysiology of obstructive sleep apnea? I made it just very, very short because all of you already know this. So the important thing, that's the reason that you're doing this neck circumference. Please remember that. Increased fat deposition around the soft tissues of the neck and tongue ultimately cause increased intraluminal pressures in the pharynx, and this increases the peak crit, or rather the critical closing pressure of the upper airways, and this causes an increased chance of airways collapse. So this is what happens basically in any obstructive sleep apnea, and obesity related reductions in FRC and total lung capacity increase the passive closing pressures at the pharynx. So you can see how obesity is compounding this problem. And during apnea, during actually an apneic spell, obese patients desaturate at a much faster level than lean controls. We know that upper airway collapse can happen in certain other conditions also. But if it has happened because of obesity, these patients desaturate much faster than lean controls who also have OSA. Now coming back to the AHI, that is the apnea hypopnea index in obesity. So increasing weight aggravates the AHI, which defines the severity of the OSA, as I already told you. And this rate of increase in apneas is exponential. At higher levels, you get a steep increase in the number of these apneic episodes. So the AHI increases steeply. What does this mean? This means that even if a patient cannot lose weight, at least he should not gain more weight so that the AHI does not increase. Because losing weight may not be easy, but at least staying at the same stable weight can still keep the patient comfortable, because as I said here, the rate of apneas is exponentially increased as the BMI keeps on increasing. So you have to tell the at first advice is don't put on more weight, at least stay where you are, and then we may be able to do something for you. So, but if you try to reduce the disease severity to an AHI of less than 15 events per hour through weight loss, it can help in achieving improved outcomes. So you reduce weight, reduce the episodes to less than 15 or the AHI to less than 15, you are actually improving the outcomes of the patient, and that should be your aim. But we know that weight loss can be difficult to achieve, it is harder to maintain, and why? And then what does it result into? It results into a vicious cycle. And the problem is that because of OSA, bad sleep, because they sleep badly, they have lower energy levels during the daytime, they cannot move, they're sleepy all the time, so no physical activity. And then they put on more and more weight, more and more apneic episodes, worse sleep, and the cycle continues. So this is the story of an OSA, and they just get worse as time goes by. Next comes the obesity hypoventilation syndrome. Now, in the obesity hypoventilation syndrome, we know that there's a subtle difference between OSA and OHS. A lot of OSA patients progress to OHS. So let's look at what the definition is, what's the diagnosis of hypoventilation syndrome. It is so simple. A BMI of more than 30 is required, perhaps less for Indians, and there should be daytime hypercapnia, and this is the level. So if these two factors are there in this patient, then we call it that this person has obesity hypoventilation syndrome. It has many physical similarities to OSA, including obesity, higher Mallampati scores, and elevated neck circumference and waist circumference. Sleep disordered breathing, history of snoring, witnessed apneas. Prevalence is higher with rising BMI, approximately 10% of OSA patients. So this is what we see. The pathogenesis now of the hypoventilation syndrome. There's a disturbance. Now this statement which I'm making over here, it seems a little complicated, but it is the most important part of the pathogenesis. The important part here is that not everybody who has OSA progresses to hypoventilation. The reason is this respiratory compensation. If the respiratory compensation is adequate, then the patient may not get hypoventilation. But in these patients who actually go to hypoventilation, the problem is that they do not have this respiratory compensation, and the reason could be that there could be a disturbance in the central control of respiration itself. So they cannot augment their respiratory drive and minute ventilation to maintain a normal PaO2 and PaCO2, and because of this, they get this restricted lung disease. Next, this is another important issue. This is probably new for you. It has been proposed that leptin may play a role in maintaining an adequate minute ventilation in obese subjects. So if an obese subject has got leptin and is leptin sensitive, he may not go into hypoventilation. But unfortunately, a lot of obese patients, they have high levels of leptin, but they have leptin resistance. And this is what happens when they have leptin resistance. Because of increased adiposity and increased leptin, these are all the problems that they have, because leptin is involved in neonatal lung development, regulates ventilatory drive, regulates immune function, increases airway hyperresponsiveness, and worsens lung function. So these are all the things that happen when leptin keeps on increasing, and leptin is increased in obese individuals because there is leptin resistance, just like there is insulin resistance. And you can see here, adipose tissue is a source of mast cell progenitor cells. So because of all these reasons, there is hypoventilation in some patients of obesity. This is the same pathophysiology. I won't go into the details. This is a graphic pictorial representation of what happens. As I said, there is fat tissue surrounding the airway. There is adipose tissue in the abdomen and in the surrounding chest walls. Atelectasis is there, and the increased respiratory drive to compensate the augmented work of breathing, which does not happen in hypoventilation syndrome, and that's how they get the OHS and the upper airway is collapsed. So clinically, they are very similar to OSA. They have almost the same things, the high BMI, the higher Mallampati scores, and elevated necks. Everything else is the same. They have sleep disordered breathing, and they have snoring and apnea. But it is important to distinguish who has OSA, who has OHS, and who have got a little overlap of both, because the treatments could be slightly different. Because OHS patients often have higher BMIs. That stands to reason, because they have bigger mechanical problems, bigger BMI, higher BMI, worse mechanical problems, and worse respiratory drive, and hence lack of compensation. So because of all that, they could all go into, so they have higher BMIs. They have more severe daytime hypercapnia and more elevated AHI levels than OSA patients. Nocturnal oxygen desaturation events are often more profound and frequent, resulting in deeper levels of nocturnal hypoxemia, and hypercapnia. This can predispose to a higher sympathetic activation, elevated oxidative stress, and higher cardiovascular risk factors. This is what we are most worried about. So the reason for treating OHS is that they can ultimately die more of cardiovascular disease because of these reasons and oxidative stress. They also have more chance of getting cor pulmonale. The mortality and morbidity from OHS is much higher than from both OSA and obesity alone. And therefore, every patient of OSA that you are treating, please try to make sure to look for hypoventilation, because the treatment has to be more aggressive, because their mortality rates are much higher. So we cannot stop at treating OSA, we have to look for the OHS also. So this is just a schematic diagram of managements of patients with obesity, hypoventilation syndrome. At diagnosis, what happens? This is the nocturnal PAP therapy, and then you need multimodal therapeutic programs. Plus, you have to take care of this diabetes and other metabolic diseases, etc. And that is why you need an algorithm like this, where you look at the AHI. If it is more than 30, this is what you do. If it is less than 30, this I don't have to tell this audience what to do. That you all know, so I won't go into the details of that. This is another slide of the same thing. Then comes obesity and asthma. Here now the relationship is a little blurred. So there are some studies which associate obesity to asthma, some which don't. But there seems to be some relationship, but it is not very definitive. So cross-sectional and longitudinal studies have linked them, and they say that the prevalence of asthma was higher by 38% in overweight patients and by 92% in obese patients. Even if their basic asthma is not going to get cured by weight loss, definitely the component of respiratory compliance or lack of it that is there added to the asthma, at least that portion can get reduced with treatment of obesity. So symptoms of asthma are increased with a rise in BMI. Obese patients who manage weight loss, they have found improvement in lung function even in asthma patients. And BMI, that's why I said that it is the relationship is blurred, because BMI does not seem to affect the eosinophil counts, the serum IgE, the hyperreactivity of the airways, etc. So that is not known, although some of the symptoms come down. So the epidemiological association between obesity and asthma is primarily due to ventilatory mechanics rather than any direct relation of inflammation between the two conditions. So basically it is the respiratory mechanics that connects the two conditions. So obese patients with asthma are known to suffer more acute attacks, frequent visits to the ER, and more hospital admissions. COPD and obesity. We know this relationship also quite well. The two conditions just compound each other. They just worsen each other. That is something that we know. Both are associated with deterioration in lung function, hypoxia, inflammation, and all of these increase the morbidity and mortality. Both these conditions do the very same things, although they are two different things. FEV1 declines as both conditions worsen. This is the second thing that happens. And a combination of COPD, obesity, and OSA worsens nocturnal and daytime hypoxia and hypercapnia, overactivation of the sympathetic system, and all of this leads to inflammation and ultimately leads to more cardiovascular morbidity and mortality. So these are the proposed mechanistic links between COPD, body fat, adipose tissue dysfunction, inflammation, and insulin resistance. As you can see very well here, COPD causes inactivity, it causes loss of fat-free mass, so respiratory muscle is compromised. There is inflammation because of that, insulin resistance. Again, there is an increase in fat mass, so tissue hypoxia, adipose tissue dysfunction, and altered adipokine secretion. So this is the schematic mechanistic link. Then next, there is some association of obesity with pulmonary hypertension, and it modifies the outcomes of pulmonary hypertension is what is said. And this study showed that obesity is independently associated with pulmonary hypertension. So this is another important fact that we need to remember. Now what happens? I'm not going, as I said, I'm not going to tell you about the pulmonary part. I'm going to tell you about the weight loss part and how it affects the respiratory mechanics. So in obesity, we have already seen what are the things that happen. So I won't go on to the left side of the screen. But with weight loss, what happens? With weight loss, the waist circumference comes down, means adiposity in the abdomen and anterior chest wall also comes down. So there is lung decompression. The FRC increases. There is restoration of tethering forces between the airway and the parenchyma, substantial dilation of central airways, and alveolar recruitment and opening of small airways. So you can see here very, very nicely how respiratory mechanics, which I had shown you in the earlier slides, how these mechanics improve once a patient starts to lose weight. So please, as pulmonologists, do not forget to stress the importance of weight loss on the respiratory condition when you are treating a patient of OSA or hypoventilation or even COPD. So that apart from the respiratory treatment, the weight loss is going to help, and the weight loss is going to make your treatment more effective. And I'm just going to dedicate now the last 3-4 slides to how exactly weight loss is achieved. Please remember, weight loss is teamwork. No single person can effect weight loss and maintain it in any clinic. It has to be teamwork because there are a lot of issues in it. We have a dietitian, we have on-call psychologist, bariatric surgeon, social worker, because there's so many issues to obesity, including depression, anxiety, etc. So this is a teamwork, and these are the teams. This is my team which helps me in taking care of all the obese patients and getting their weights down. The dietary aspects, there are several approaches. We use meal replacements, very low calorie diets, meal supplements, low carbohydrate diets, protein supplementation. We stress on whole unprocessed foods. But at the end of the day, this is the most important part. We have to customize and we have to do a lot of manipulation. Activity and exercise has to be graded. These are obese patients. They do not have good fitness levels, but we have to emphasize the importance of activity and exercise, both from the pulmonology point of view as well as from the metabolic point of view. And they can take up whatever they are able to, whatever they are interested in. So there are various things. So there are aerobic exercises, then there are weight training exercises. All of these are important. Somebody may want to go swimming. So this has to be built very, very gradually. Somebody can go cycling. This is, I am an avid cyclist myself, and this is me cycling on some street somewhere in the world. Some people like to dance. So there are various ways in which we advise the patient on what activity and exercise they're supposed to do. Pharmacotherapy may be extremely important for people, especially if they have OSA and hypoventilation. This is just one example of a drug that can be used, which is liraglutide. In India, it is still off-label, but it can still be used. Bariatric surgery is, of course, an option. There are very many studies which tell us that obstructive sleep apnea, hypoventilation improves considerably with bariatric surgery, and that is an option that must be offered to the patient. Please do not forget that at the end of the day, whether it is pulmonology or whether it is obesity treatment, the mind-body connection is extremely important to keep the person in a positive frame of mind and constantly motivated. These are two of my own workshops that we hold on a regular basis to help patients to find the mind-body connection. And this is very, very important, and it must be undertaken by anyone who is attempting weight loss and anyone who has any kind of chronic disease. So my take-home messages for you all as pulmonologists are, please keep a weighing scale in your clinic. You have to calculate the body mass index because you need to prognosticate. You need to tell the patient the severity of his problem and how it is going to improve or decline based on this particular weighing scale and what it is going to tell you and the patient. Please keep a measuring tape for two reasons. One is the neck circumference, and the second is for abdominal obesity. So the waist circumference also needs to be seen. These are two simple tools which, if you keep at your front desk, and even your receptionist or your clinical assistant can every visit look at this and tell you what the body mass index is, what the waist circumference is, and you chart it out and tell the patient and tell him, look, this is what is happening. You are increasing your weight, your respiratory problems are increasing. So this is the only thing you need to tell the patient. And most importantly, please refer them to a weight loss program. It is not easy. It is not enough to tell the patient just to eat less and walk more. It never helps, because obesity treatment is a separate scientific entity altogether, and it needs to be handled in that fashion. A lot of hand holding has to be done for prolonged periods of time to gain weight, to have weight loss and maintain that weight loss. And they should kickstart a weight loss program so that their respiratory condition will improve by leaps and bounds. So I thank CCI once again for giving me this opportunity, and I thank you all for a patient listening, and I would be very, very happy to take any questions at this point of time. Thank you.
So now the question answer session is open. So if you have any questions, then please do send from those link. So first question is by Dr. Amuta Kumar from Mumbai. Obesity-induced long-term sustained hypoxia causes a bone demineralization like osteoporosis, especially in the post-menopausal group. So what is your experience and suggestions to be active 90 plus?
The last part of the question, can you just repeat?
What are the suggestions to be active in 90 plus people?
Okay. Well, this is a very different population. What you can do after you're 90 is actually dictated by what you had been doing when you reached 90. So if you had been exercising well, and if your muscle mass was reasonably good, and your muscle joint flexibility was reasonably good, then it is definitely, you can lead a fruitful life even post 90. Of course, you've got to be careful because some amount of osteoporosis is going to set in. But the fact that you've reached 90, it obviously means that, well, the health of your muscles and your bones is pretty good, and that should see you through. So it's joint flexibility, balance. These are the most important things for leading a fruitful life at that time.
Okay. So rather than waiting for a 90 plus year, we should start our exercise and everything from today onwards.
Absolutely.
So the next question is again by Dr. Amuta Kumar, sir. Morbid obesity in Indian ethnics and obstructive respiratory disorder, especially in post-COVID people.
Yes. So morbid obesity is in any case associated with obstructive sleep apnea. That I've already shown you through my slides that the higher the BMI, more are the chances of obstructive sleep apnea. And added to that, as I said already, neck circumference and abdominal obesity are very, very predictive of who will develop OSA. And in the post-COVID-19 scenario, it can even be worse because as pulmonologists, and I think you've all been seeing cases where post-COVID patient is otherwise fine, but is dependent on oxygen. You're seeing cases of fibrosis. So this is going to add to the increased work of breathing and worsen and pre-existing OSA to a large extent.
Okay. There's one more question by Dr. Nagaraja from Madanpalle. How to treat obesity and to find causes?
Well, that's actually, it seems like a simple question, but it is a very, very interesting question. The root causes of obesity basically fall into three categories. The root causes fall into the category of increased intake, reduced expenditure, and metabolic factors. So increased intake, it's not just eating. There could be several factors to it. is there mindless eating? Is there emotional eating? Are there triggers for that kind of eating? So this is about increased eating. Reduced activity can have a range of reasons for it. Simply that it could be lack of motivation because of depression, or it could be because a person is staying in an area where he cannot exercise, he doesn't have the means to exercise, or there is somebody who has, say, skeletal problems like osteoarthritis. How can that person exercise, or he is not being told what other exercises he can do? So because of this, this falls into the second category. And the third category is metabolic factors like age and sex. For example, as you age, you know that your metabolic rate starts to go down. In the female sex, the fat percentage is more, so calorie burning is less. So based on all these factors, now several of these factors, one, two, or many of them may be operational in a single person. So what we do is we have a checklist, and we try to see in this checklist which of these factors are operational in a given patient, and then focus on those particular points. So there are many causes of obesity, and every person is different, and we need to actually really pinpoint this. And so that's why I said that this is a very good question. It's actually the place to start from about in obesity.
Okay. So there's one more question from Dr. Ananta Krishnan from Chennai. What is the ideal weight above which we can call the individual as obese?
I did show a slide, but I would like to tell you once again that the Asia Pacific guidelines, the cutoff points are a little lower for us. So I'm going to tell you the Asia Pacific guidelines. Between 18 to 22.9 is supposed to be normal weight. 23 and above, or till 24.9 is overweight, and above 25 it's considered obese, with 2-3 different gradations of obesity. So that is the cutoff point based on body mass index. The guidelines all talk about only body mass index, but as I said to you before, it's not just body mass index that is important. Body fat percentage, where that fat is distributed, that is a different kind of obesity that is equally important because of two reasons. One, it decides how much weight and how you're going to lose depending on the fat percentage. And second, the area where this excess fat is located is going to decide your cardiometabolic fate.
Okay. So next question is from Dr. M. Mahesh from Mysore. What is are DPP-4 inhibitors associated with weight gain or abdominal obesity?
No. DPP-4 inhibitors, fortunately, is a class of drugs that is completely weight neutral. Some studies have shown little bit of weight loss, but they are otherwise completely weight neutral. They do not cause. I think the question that you wanted to ask was probably about GLP-1 receptor agonists. It's a completely different class of drugs. They are also incretins, but they are incretin analogs, basically. And GLP-1 receptor analogs, especially I showed you a slide about liraglutide. Liraglutide today in the US at 3 milligrams per day as an injectable is approved for use as an anti-obesity drug even in the absence of diabetes, although it originally came in as an anti-diabetic drug. In India, the cutoff point is 1.8 milligrams, and there is still no indication for its use in only obesity. It is still indicated for use or licensed for use in diabetes patients, but the weight loss associated with it is quite phenomenal.
Okay. There's one more question from Hyderabad by Dr. K. Satish Kumar. How obesity affects sleep apnea? Well,
that was what the talk was all about. And I already told you that in obesity, there is excess amount of fat in the anterior chest wall, which restricts the movement and increases the work of breathing. There is excess amount of fat in the abdomen, viscera, etc., which hinders the movement of the diaphragm and again increases the work of breathing. The basal parts of the lungs do not expand well enough, and this leads to obstructive sleep apnea. There are several other factors which I also showed you, because of which the upper airways collapse easily, especially in the supine position, and that's the pathogenesis of obstructive sleep apnea.
Okay. There's one question by Dr. Gopi Krishna from Vijayawada. Is there evidence for weight loss and better asthma control?
Some. The reason I will tell you how it is. Asthma by itself is, I told you that the link between obesity and asthma per se, especially the inflammatory part and the hyperreactive part, the relationship is not well established. But in an asthmatic patient, obesity confers an extra amount of restriction of lung movement because of the same reasons as it is there in a non-asthmatic obese individual. So that particular component which is there because of obesity and which restricts the movements of the lungs, at least that part is removed when there is weight loss. So the asthmatic attacks per se may not reduce, but the severity of the asthmatic attacks can definitely be reduced because of the excess burden of that obesity which is removed with weight loss.
Okay, ma'am. There is a question by Dr. Dinesh Saraswat from Ghaziabad. It is seen that there are two types of obesity. One is metabolically stable and have normal BP, no diabetes or ischemic heart disease, etc., while other are metabolically unstable. Do they behave same way in OHA and OHS?
No. Now, this is, if I understand correctly, what this person is talking about is obese but metabolically normal versus obese with metabolic abnormalities. In terms of OSA, do they behave in the same way? Yes, they do. Because OSA is basically, there are mechanical problems that are there, and mechanical problems are going to be there in both these kind sets of patients, regardless of whether metabolic abnormalities are there or not there. That is precisely what I said right in the beginning of my talk, that obesity has several consequences. Cardiometabolic are the ones that are most hyped, and people talk a lot about the cardiometabolic, but the pulmonary, musculoskeletal, and mechanical complications which are there, they are there regardless of whether there is diabetes, obesity, and any of those things. So that is not important. So this OSA can be there in obese individuals, even if they do not have the other metabolic abnormalities that are usually associated with obesity. But please remember, once an obese person develops OSA, he is then more likely to have cardiometabolic abnormalities afterwards.
Okay. Dr. Raju Kota from Vishakhapatnam, he is asking, as a pulmonologist, what are the drugs I can prescribe for cases who refuse to go for surgery?
Refuse to go for obesity surgery, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically what we are touching upon now is the pharmacotherapy of obesity. Unfortunately, in the past, there has been a very bad history of anti-obesity drugs. All the anti-obesity drugs that have come in the past have had so many side effects that each one came into the market, stayed for some time, and then there were so many side effects that it had to be pulled out. Right from fenfluramine down to rimonabant, then sibutramine, now the latest being lorcaserin. All these drugs came, induced good weight loss, and then they went away. The only one that has stayed now, as I told you, is liraglutide. And liraglutide is supposed to be one of the good drugs. I was involved in the clinical trials, the phase 3 clinical trials for liraglutide, after which it did get FDA approval in the US, as I already mentioned to you, as a drug for weight loss. In India, we are using it mainly for diabetics, but then there are certain obese individuals who really don't respond too well to diet and exercise, and we are using this pharmacotherapy. But the only problem is liraglutide is expensive, and the second problem is that it is injectable. We still don't have an oral version of it, though there are some GLP-1 receptor analogs which are oral that are in the pipeline, and we may have them next year or so. Other than that, the only one oral drug that has been approved for use is orlistat. And orlistat is a lipase inhibitor, not very useful in Indians who don't have that great a fat amount in their diet. And the weight loss that has been seen with orlistat is very, very little. It is about 3 to 4 kgs at the end of 6 months. I can get much more weight loss in my obese patients with lifestyle modification. actually much more than orlistat. So as pulmonologists, there is really nothing much you can prescribe by way of pharmacotherapy per se, unless you can prescribe GLP-1 receptor agonist. You just have to understand how to prescribe it, and you may be able to do that.
So, ma'am, you have already answered a few questions which have come orlistat. So we will move to the next question. How to measure visceral fat in lean or any other patient?
Visceral fat, the surrogate marker is abdominal circumference. So abdominal circumference is the only way to measure it. The only other way to measure it is by, if you want to do it really quantitatively, then and see it precisely, then it has to be by MRI. But otherwise, visceral fat or abdominal fat is measured very well, and there are enough validated studies to show that you do an abdominal circumference, and we know that it is 80 centimeters in women and 100 centimeters in men. These are the cutoff points for Indians, or rather in the Asia Pacific region, and that should be fine. So abdominal circumference is fine.
Will yoga help for weight reduction, and what type of yoga will help in weight reduction? This is the question by Dr. B. Ramankar from Iluru.
Okay. Let me say at the outset, first and foremost, that exercise is not a tool for weight loss. You will be surprised and you might think that my statement is very scandalous, but yes, if you really want weight loss, it is diet. Exercise is good for fitness, is good for stamina, is good for balance, is good for the cardiac system. It's good in many ways. It helps you metabolically. It helps to reduce your cholesterol, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, all of that thing. But it does not cause weight loss. It has to be done. And especially so, its actual role comes when you start maintaining your lost weight. So when you come to the point of weight maintenance, there exercise becomes more important, because once you've lost weight, your metabolic rate starts to go down. So one of the ways in which you can increase your metabolic rate and keep it at least at a little higher level is exercise. So that is one part of it. The second part of it is that yoga is one type of exercise. If you look at it as a physical exercise, I'm not talking about the yoga of the mind, because asanas and yogic poses are just one part of yoga. Anyone who is a practitioner of yoga will tell you that yoga has got many components to it, and asanas and the physical part is only one part of it. Having said that, if you are asking me whether the physical part of yoga, that is yogasanas, help in weight loss, it is only partial, because exercise is of many types. And the ideal way to do exercise is to do a mix and match of all the three types of exercise. And there are three types basically. All of you would probably know that. One is aerobic, or we call it cardio exercises. Second is strength training, or resistance training. And third is flexibility and stretching. Yoga comes in this third category. And you are supposed to do all the three types at different times during the week to get an overall fitness and to get overall exercise. So doing only yoga, one, is not going to give you weight loss, because as I said, weight loss does not happen only with exercise unless it's coupled with diet. And if you were to do only yoga and neglect aerobic and weight training, then also you are not going to benefit.
This was a very important point which you highlighted. Whenever I used to have extra food, I used to think that my exercise will decrease. So that's a very important point which you highlighted.
If you've had a good meal of pizza and say a burger or something, let me tell you, Dr. Mahesh, you would have to walk 6 hours to burn it off. So it just doesn't match up. Right? This is number one. And while we are at it, let me also tell you that, it's good to, even I wear this. Okay. So all of us are doing all these kind of things. But you do your treadmill, you walk 1 hour, you look at that counter and you say, oh, I've burned 200 calories. That 200 calories is not important, because that 200 calories is heavily dependent upon your muscle mass. If you have a high fat mass, you're not going to burn even 200 calories. So does that mean you should not exercise? No, it doesn't, because the true benefits of exercise are seen in your metabolism 24 hours after that episode of exercise. So that episode doesn't work only for that 1 hour. Its good effects last much longer, and you do exercise for those effects and not for that 1 hour of burning 200 calories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Our next question is by Dr. Raju Kota, Visakhapatnam. He's asking that how accurate is smartwatch for sleep data?
How accurate is the smartwatch for?
Sleep data.
Sleep data. I'm really not aware of that. Because I'm not an expert in sleep medicine basically, but so I really wouldn't be able to answer that question. Maybe a pulmonologist who is actually doing sleep studies would be able to tell better, or maybe you conduct a study and see what happens. Actually, do the sleep studies for that person.
Yes. So there's the next question. Is there anything like non-obese OSA?
Yes, there are other. See, obesity is one of the key reasons for OSA, but there are other reasons for upper airways to collapse. So the basic problem here is that the upper airways collapse easily, especially in the supine position. So there are so many other conditions in which the upper airways can collapse. Not very many conditions. Obesity is still one of the most common causes for upper airways collapse, but there could be other reasons for muscle weakness which actually lead to the upper airways collapse. So yes, you can have it in non-obese individuals as well.
There's one question by Dr. Mohammad Abdul Bais from Dhaka. What is your suggestion concerning screening and treating OSA or OHS-induced pulmonary hypertension?
What is the treatment part of it?
Yeah, screening and treatment. OSA and OHS-induced pulmonary hypertension.
So you are going to screen for OSA. You are going to screen for the hypoventilation. So the assessment is going to be as you do it for every OSA and obesity, the hypoventilation syndromes. And if pulmonary hypertension supervenes, you are definitely going to treat it as per the norms. So there is not going to be any, I did show you an algorithm for it, but otherwise the main thing is you detect it. Once you detect it, treatment goes along the same lines. It's not separate. The idea is to detect it as early as possible. So as I said, every patient of OSA you should look for hypoventilation as well, because the treatment needs to be more aggressive. So in that sense, yes, treatment has to be more aggressive if you detect hypoventilation, because the outcomes are worse. That's the reason.
Next question is by Dr. Ravi Bhaskar from Lucknow. Is Herbalife useful for weight loss as they guarantee?
No, not at all. Because this is a question that a lot of people ask me when I go for my talks on diabetes and obesity. Now, Herbalife, basically, since the brand name has already been taken by the delegate, I will use the name. But Herbalife, there are reports in the BMJ for hepatotoxic deaths with Herbalife. That is number one. Second is, if anybody goes on liquid diet for 3 times a day, all right, he's going to lose weight because you're going to reduce the number of calories. So ultimately, it becomes a VLCD. VLCD is very low calorie diet. The only problem with Herbalife is that there is no doctor involved. This is direct marketing, and there is no doctor as such involved in telling you that you're using Herbalife, reduce this medication, or get these tests done, or test your liver function test. Nobody is there. So it's not a medically supervised weight loss program. And I am a firm believer that weight loss is a medical issue. So it should not be undertaken by non-medical, non-professionals. You are bound to land into trouble. And initial weight loss may be there, but the weight is all going to come back because nobody tells you how to wean yourself off once you have lost weight. You can't keep taking Herbalife lifelong, right? So if you have to wean it off, while weaning it off, what you're supposed to do, you need a pediatric physician, you need a proper qualified nutritionist, and then only the weight loss is going to get maintained.
Next question is by Dr. Ramchandra Babar from Pune. Is there any link between the gut flora and alveoli as per the overeating and dyspnea point of view?
I do not know about gut microbiota affecting alveoli, but I do know for 100% that gut microbiota have a huge role to play in inflammation and a huge role to play in the genesis of obesity. For sure, and in that way indirectly, but whether it directly affects the alveoli, I do not know.
Dr. Jai Krishna Mishra from Ghaziabad, he wants to ask, what is a drug of choice to reduce obesity?
Have we already discussed that? I told you the only approved one is Orlistat in India. Off label, we use liraglutide.
There's one question by Dr. Trilip Chatterjee. How much does alcohol cause weight gain? I think this
A
is
lot. Because in any weight loss program, if you have to account for the carbohydrate content in alcohol, all your calories will get over only in the alcohol and you eat nothing else. And you know that alcohol has empty calories, there is no nutrition whatsoever, they're just sugar calories. So obviously, it's a very, very bad idea if you are on a weight loss program.
Okay. There's one question. What is the role of keto diet in reducing the weight?
Well, keto diet is relatively new as far as weight loss is concerned. Although it has been used in the past, it actually first came in historically for the alleviation of epilepsy. So the number of epileptic episodes would reduce with a keto diet. So that is how it came. And then they found that it causes weight loss as well. So keto diets, the safety of keto diets in today's time, the meta-analysis and the evidence that we have is for 2 years. Beyond 2 years, it has not been studied for its safety. Weight loss is quite high, especially in the first 6 months, but it gradually slows down at the end of 1 year and it's almost equal to other diets as far as weight loss is concerned. It has its merits and demerits, but please remember, a keto diet done under the guidance of a qualified nutrition and a bariatric physician, then it can be attempted. But outside of that, by looking at the internet or by looking at these Facebook sponsored ads, it's not a good idea because it can be very, very dangerous if there is no physician looking at you closely all the time.
Okay. Ma'am, this is a practical question. How do you practically approach metabolically obese person in state-of-art department versus a public hospital?
It's very interesting, and unfortunately, there is no simple answer to this. In a public hospital, if there is a dedicated space, time, and person for obesity, still a lot of good things can be done. You don't need very high funda equipment to treat obesity. All you need is a good dedicated physician who is well versed with treating obesity and a good nutritionist with very good common sense advice. So in a public hospital, as I already mentioned in my slides, what you need is a good digital scale. You need a tape. These are the two things that are going to help you. And a good nutritionist who will take a good diet recall and quickly calculate the calories, carbs, and proteins and fats that the person is ingesting. And you make a plan because, as I said, obesity, there is no one size that fits all. So it has to be customized to a large extent. And this can be done only with the help of these two people, basically. So in a public hospital, it can be done. But if you are in a private setup, then the sky is the limit. Then you can have, calipers, and then you can have a bioimpedance analysis. You can have DEXA for the measurement of the fat. You can have an MRI, and then you can do so many things if you are in a private setup. But as I said, the intent, the passion, and the knowledge is important. So if that is there, even in a public hospital, I don't see any reason why you cannot achieve good bit of weight loss if this is done. The other important thing which probably could be a hindrance in a public hospital is the lack of data entry, data upkeep, and follow-up. So every time if a different person is going to see the same patient, it does not work in weight loss. So if that can be ensured and achieved, even in a public hospital, it is still possible. Of course, training is required because you need passion for this, because obesity treatment, like in diabetes, a foot surgeon, for example, anyone who takes up diabetic foot needs to have a passion to treat that, because the satisfaction is very late in coming. Same way in obesity also. So the job satisfaction that you get comes very late. You have to be very patient, and only those kind of people can treat successfully in obesity.
Okay. So, ma'am, how do any validated scores available for obesity associated diseases apart from BMI?
Yeah, that's a very good question. As I said, BMI does not tell you the entire story. So you require actually body fat, but there is no score or there is no cutoff point in the literature which tells you that this much should be the body fat percentage. Lower the better. But in general, rule of thumb is whether it's male or female, the ideal body fat percentage should not cross 25%. So if you have any means of checking out, then this is what the cutoff point should be. Whether you're using a bioimpedance machine or you are using the DEXA, that should be the aim of keeping it at around 25%, which doesn't always happen. So that is the thing. There are no other validated scores. However, if you're really interested to know the staging of obesity in terms of how to treat it, I would refer you to something called the EOSS. EOSS is the Edmonton Obesity Staging System, which is a little different from the usual WHO. WHO just grades obesity based on BMI, whereas staging of obesity by the EOSS tells you not only the grade but also tells you the stage based on 3 or 4 parameters. These 3 or 4 parameters are: one is the psychiatric condition, okay, say that is the mental function. Another is the skeletal, the musculoskeletal problems that the patient could have, or rather the comorbidities that the patient is having, and his functional capacity. So it does not go only by BMI. So if you have a BMI of just 27, but the patient has osteoarthritis or has obstructive sleep apnea, he goes to a higher grade. Whereas a person who has a body mass index of 35 but has no obstructive sleep apnea, no spine problem, no limitation of activity, then his stage goes to a lower stage. So this staging is based not on BMI but on functionality, based on the mental makeup and so many other parameters. So the EOSS is one of the very good parameters. It was basically made, or it was conceived by Dr. Arya Sharma, under whom I went to work in Canada for quite some time, many years ago. So he is, and this is now accepted even by the American Obesity Society. They are also using this to stage the person with functionality.
Ma'am, what are the recommendations for commercially available supplements in Indian setup?
There are no, let us say, there are no recommendations or guidelines, but commercially available supplements and meal replacements are used quite a lot by all of us in the obesity field, because they have several advantages to it. One is that you know exactly how many calories, carbohydrates and proteins are going in. Second is, when you're making a structured program like this with very low calories, these meal replacements are fortified with minerals and vitamins. So you know that they are also going in. And thirdly, they motivate the patient because the weight loss is pretty quick and it's very easy to carry, especially if a person is on a structured diet, quite motivated, but decides to travel. And when he's traveling, he doesn't know where his next healthy meal is coming from. That is the time, if he's having his meal replacement with him, just adds water, mixes it and has it. So there are many advantages of meal replacements if they are used correctly. If they are used correctly. Again, I will keep on repeating that all these, whether it is a keto diet or whether it is commercially available supplement, they must be used under medical supervision.
Okay, ma'am. Next question is, ma'am, in a very obese patient, how to advise physical activity?
Yes, so that can become a huge problem. A very obese individual, and he is now on a weight loss program. How do you start about activity? The first thing I would say is that the first 2 months we do not prescribe any rigorous activity. Just routine activity, whatever the patient is doing is just fine. Once he loses a little weight, he is likely to become lighter and much more able to do some exercise. The reason that we do not advocate heavy exercise in the first 2 months is that obesity is a state and condition of immense inflammation. There is inflammation in the fat cells in the body. This gives rise to a lot of aches and pains. Exercise induces further inflammation, and the person will stop exercising after the first 2 or 3 days. And that is the reason that we want that. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is an obese individual has reduced muscle mass and he is physically unfit. So he could get injuries when he starts to exercise without fitness. So we would rather that person go to a physiotherapist, strengthen the muscles around the knees and ankles by doing good physiotherapy for a few weeks, by which time he also loses some weight, and then embark gradually into graded exercise.
Okay. What is the role of intermittent fasting?
Intermittent fasting is again, it's not a new concept. Our dadis and nanis used to do different kinds of fasting, which was again like an intermittent fasting itself. Intermittent fasting has got some role, especially in reducing, they say, insulin resistance and insulin levels, and in that way helps to, reduce weight. But again, it has to be done under supervision, especially if the patient is diabetic. There are other reasons for during which time you cannot do this kind of intermittent fasting. Say someone has got severe gastroesophageal reflux, as it happens in diabetes, in obese individuals. These are the patients who cannot take up intermittent fasting, but it can be tried. The reason it can be tried is it is those many hours of no caloric intake at all. So in that sense, it starts getting a person, an obese person, used to eating less and less. So it has its effects. The studies are underway, but we do not have any, uniform consensus on whether it can be advocated in all cases of obesity.
What are the predictors and factors for weight loss maintenance?
Yeah, so this is the most important thing, because yo-yo dieting is worse than actually not losing weight. In fact, if a person stays at the same weight and works on his fitness, he may be better off than losing 20 and then gaining back 30. That is the worst kind of thing that can happen to anybody. And that is why weight maintenance becomes very important. There are 2-3 factors in weight maintenance. Number one is exercise. Here comes the role of exercise. Okay, so exercise is extremely important. Second is, if the protein intake is very low, weight loss is not maintained. So adequate, I'm not talking about high protein, I'm talking about adequate protein. So adequate protein intake, that again becomes important. And the third most important thing in maintaining weight loss is resistance training exercise. So you do resistance training, build muscle, and that way you can attempt to maintain your weight loss.
Okay. My next question is, what is the role of meal replacements in obesity treatment?
Yeah, so as I already mentioned, meal replacements are commercially available supplements and complete meal replacements, and their role is very important in kickstarting the weight loss. It motivates patients, and liquid calories occupy less space in the abdomen, and the stomach elasticity can actually be made to come down a little by giving liquid meals, which are adequate calories. So they have a role, and we use them extensively in all our programs of weight loss.
Okay. Ma'am, what type of exercise?
Yeah, I think I already mentioned that to you while I was talking about yoga. that there are 3 types of exercise, and one should attempt to do all the 3 types at different times during the week. So there is no one best exercise. Having said that, some exercise is better than no exercise. But if you ask for best exercise, then it's a combination of all the 3 that I mentioned, which is aerobic, resistance exercise, and flexibility training.
Okay. Up till now, we were talking only about the weight loss. I just want to ask the last 2 questions on weight gain. There are many young people, they go for the muscle training.
Yes.
And there are multiple supplements are available in the market.
Yeah.
It has been said that a few of the supplements have anabolic steroid, which we do not want. So which supplement, how to go for this kind of diet?
Well, the problem is that these, and sports nutrition is completely different. So people who are actually trying to build muscle and who are into competitive weightlifting or something like that, I'm not even talking about those. I'm talking about regular people who are not in the business of, doing competitive, weight, these kind of competitions, just regular human beings. So these are the people who should not be taking anabolic steroids. There is no need for them. And this is usually prescribed by gym instructors and personal trainers. So unless you have verified with a bariatric physician and a nutritionist, it should not be taken. So these supplements, you can actually take snapshots of it, talk to your bariatric physician. And nowadays with teleconsultation, weight loss can be done from anywhere. I mean, if you want a good nutritionist, available online, bariatric physicians also available. We are doing several teleconsultation weight loss programs for so many people and helping them. So it can be done nowadays. So unless you have taken the advice of a medical professional, I don't think one should go for this.
Ma'am, last question of the day. As a pulmonologist, we come across many patients of tuberculosis, drug sensitive versus drug resistance. They already have loss of appetite and they are on multiple drugs. They are dealing with nausea, vomiting, etc., etc. We do advise them high protein diet at our level as per the nutritionist advice. So how should we go for a weight gain in such patients, apart from a dietary advice?
Yeah, I would suggest that do not look at the weight gain part of it. Look at the nutritional quality of the food. So it's not an important thing to, just gain weight. Do you know we have so many obese individuals who are terribly deficient in all the nutrients. So it's not the weight that tells you whether that person is nutritionally okay or not. It is actually the measurement of vitamin B12, vitamin D, the calcium level. Supplement those things. Supplement proteins to see that he has enough protein, 1 gram per kg body weight. Just make sure that he has adequate fat as well. So you count those things rather than concentrating on the weighing scale in such patients. I always tell them, so, concentrate on their stamina, concentrate on their fitness, concentrate on their protein intakes, concentrate on their micronutrients. So nutritionally adequate diet has to be given rather than looking at the number on the weighing scale. That would be my advice.
Thank you very much. And with this, I would like to end the question and answer session because the questions are coming already. 30-40 questions are already in line. So in a paucity of time, it's already 9:23. I'll take your permission to close the session now.
Sure.
Ma'am, thank you very much, ma'am, for your wonderful session enlightening us on obesity in respiratory medicine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
So I thank Dr. N.H. Krishna, Dr. Pradeepa, Dr. Narendra, Dr. Ravi Doshi, and Dr. Chinam Chetty for giving us an opportunity to be here. And I thank all the viewers for their patient listening and a very interesting question and answer session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.